Well, I guess we might as well start. Our panel has had some dropout right here, but we have Pat Bryan from YES and Dr. Guerrero from Hennepin County General Hospital. And maybe you'd like to introduce yourselves and say what you do and what your involvement with the subject is.
Okay, I don't know how many people know what YES is. It's a 24-hour telephone service, 7 days a week. What we do is information and referral and crisis intervention counseling. The people that work there are non-professional. They go through a training session, and the training is really kind of, the emphasis is on communication skills, listening skills, how to relate to people over the phone. I'm a volunteer at YES. I'm working in the training program and as a phone volunteer, and I'm doing some administrative work.
I'm a psychiatrist. I spend half of my time working in the Crisis Intervention Center of the General Hospital and the other half of my time working in the inpatient psychiatric unit of General Hospital. The Crisis Intervention Center is a 24-hour-a-day unit also. It operates as an extension. Well, this is not a completely true statement, but in many ways it constitutes an emergency room for social and psychiatric problems. We have a rather well-developed professional staff. We rely on completely paid professionals. We have social workers, psychiatric nurses, some community health workers. We have 24-hour-a-day medical coverage and psychiatric coverage. And we have access to a number of different referrals agencies, including the hospitalization of patients when that's necessary. We do deal in crisis intervention primarily and in a number of unscheduled and walk-in functions. We have been functioning for approximately 2 years now and see on the average of 600 people a month on a walk-in basis, plus a very active telephone service, similar to what YES does.
Okay, well, we can run this any way we want. If you want to ask these people questions, if you fail, I have some questions. Or just reactions to the speech or anything we want to talk about. Does anybody have any questions for these people? No? Well, why don't we talk a little bit about, your involvement with suicide in particular. You were just talking before about, your breakdown of calls. Okay. And
Yeah, we've just done a recent statistical breakdown of calls, and what that involves is tallying every call that comes through the service. Our actual suicide kinds of calls are about 3%. What it usually involves for the volunteer, if it's like a threatened suicide, is trying to offer alternatives to the person. We look at it from the point of view that, suicide is one alternative of a way to solve a problem. We try and find more alternatives for the person in order to solve this problem. We don't, like in a sort of a threatened suicide kind of situation, we don't go out to the person. It's strictly a phone service. We don't see the person. We do have crisis intervention teams, which are a group of clergymen and seminarians who will go out on calls for us, and they do have legal sanction, which our volunteers don't. In the areas of like overdose, whether it's accidental or intentional overdose, we have a good relationship with the telephone company in order to trace calls. However, this can take up to an hour depending on where the person is and what kind of telephone setup they've got. So if a decision is going to be made to trace a call in like an overdose or a suicide attempt, it has to be made right away. Then the volunteer will try and get the information from the person, the name, the address, what's going on. In cases of a gun or a knife, it's our obligation to also notify the police department that this is what's happening, so that if an ambulance driver is going to go in, or if the police are being sent out, they know what they're going to find when they get there. So I guess what the main thing is trying to offer alternatives for people who are in a suicidal situation. Also trying to prevent the suicide if possible, and in the case of an overdose, to get them medical help as soon as possible.
Could you characterize what a suicide call might be like? Have you answered any?
Yeah, I have. It's almost impossible to characterize
Yeah.
it. Each one is so individual. I guess, like I can give an example of the first suicide call I got was a man who was calling and saying that he'd been driving a car and his brother had been killed in the accident and he escaped without even a scratch. And, the whole feeling of guilt and responsibility was, one of the biggest parts of the whole hassle. Like my attempt was to say, were you responsible for what happened? And try and offer alternatives to him. His whole idea was, I should have been the one that was killed. I was responsible for the accident. My brother didn't have anything to do with it. It's hard to say whether the call is successful or not. You don't always make people happy at the end of the call. That's not the point. The point is maybe to try and, get a few things straight, to kind of rationalize things for the person, to, feed back to them what they're saying, to help them look at what they're saying a little bit more.
Okay, what about you and your involvement with suicide?
Our contact at the General Hospital is somewhat different. We get a number of telephone calls as well, but frequently we see the people who have made an attempt. That would mean that somebody has overdosed or has made some sort of effort to injure themselves, and a friend, a relative, somebody has brought them to the emergency room. After they're treated, then they would be referred to us. Having prevented that suicide from being a completed act, we have to then decide what, if anything, can be done to help that person over whatever their particular crisis is, the thing that precipitated the suicide attempt. So we do have a little better chance to follow what has happened with the suicide attempt. And I guess what almost always turns out to be the case is that people have chosen suicide as their last effort, their effort out of frustration to deal with a problem that they weren't able to handle. It takes some digging, some time to discover what it was in this particular person's life that led them to feel overwhelmed and unable to find a more attractive or a more satisfactory solution than simply turning against oneself. But generally, that can be discovered with some time and some cooperation. The individual is able to get to those things that created the trouble. And then, because as an outsider, you're always able to see things with some more perspective than a person caught in their own lives is, it's sometimes possible to begin to see different ways of doing things.
There's one thing I wanted to add, too, that we are a crisis intervention service, and like our philosophy or the way we attempt to handle calls is, to deal with the problem as it's presented, but we also encourage volunteers, like at the end of the call when it doesn't seem to be going any farther, to refer that person to some kind of counseling service.
Like you said, your patients or the people you see are generally referred to you from the hospital, right? Mm-hmm. Do you then see them on an outpatient basis after that?
what we try
Or
to do
you
in
see
our...
them while they're still in the hospital.
We see them while they're still in the hospital. The emergency room is physically about 10 feet from us. And when people finish at the emergency room, somebody walks them down to us and we talk to them. So it all occurs as a single incident.
I see.
After we have talked, at that point, we usually can reach a conclusion with the individual as to what went wrong and what steps might be taken as alternatives to doing that foolish thing again. And then, if need be, we help them get established in some sort of ongoing counseling effort, such as the mental health center, children and family services, private therapist, a number of different things like that. It may be that there's been a financial crisis, and the best advice that we can offer them, or the best referral we can make, is to one branch of the welfare department which handles specifically financial advice and helps people make sense out of their messed up financial existences. It may be that they are having marital troubles and that this was an impulsive and angry, frustrated act, and that they need some marriage counseling, and so we help them get set up with that.
Do you feel they usually follow up on that kind of thing? I wonder, is anyone ever angry that they haven't succeeded and still intend to go out and try again?
Well, yeah, we have people who do try multiple times.
How prevalent is the thought of committing suicide for, let's say, teenagers? Is it?
I don't think I can give you prevalence figures. Since the teenage years are fairly tumultuous years, I suspect that the rate is higher. It's a very important cause of death in the teenage years, rating I think second or third, with traumatic accidents being first, and I think suicide next or third in the line. So it certainly is not an insignificant phenomenon. It's a pretty important thing that happens to teenagers.
The times I've gone to speak in front of groups, and the area of young people, the area of suicide comes up as one thing that YES does. I would volunteer that. The kids become really excited about the whole thing. They really want to find out, and they want to know about the legal aspect of it, which we don't, I heard tonight it's a misdemeanor, but
Yeah.
they're constantly, they bring it back to that topic, either because, I don't know why, usually on the basis their friends are thinking about it.
Well, it's a fascinating point. I think what you're getting there is the struggle with self-determination. What do I have power over? Is really the kind of question that's being asked. When people want to know the rules, they kind of know, they want to know what can I do and what can't I do. What accrues to me in terms of my individual right to do things and what belongs to somebody else. And of course, all those power issues are very important, probably in the teen years and the early adult years when people are kind of wrestling with life, trying to figure out what they can make happen and what things are likely to overwhelm them.
Well, what's happening then? I also understand that the tendency has gone towards a lower age of attempt at suicide. And then maybe...
I don't know. You heard something on figures like that?
Question?
Pressure, wouldn't it have something that, there's so much more pressure today than there was, 10 years ago.
We all believe that. I don't know that it's true because it's said so much. I keep thinking of the stuff that I've heard about. I came from Chicago, and I have several relatives who are policemen, and they used to say that you could create a crime wave any day of the week by simply publishing accurately the crime figures or giving enough of the crime stories a place of importance in the daily newspapers, and that the sense of how much, quote, crime there was at any one time depended far more upon how much media attention any particular crime was getting than any real changes in figures. So I can't say. I know we all feel, and it's constantly thrust upon us, that this is a very, very hard time. A time with multiple stresses and changes that none of us understand. Maybe that's true. I guess as we get older, we'll get a chance to look back and decide. When you're in the middle of any kind of mess, it's hard to say, whether yours is any worse than anybody else's. I don't know if that's true, though, or not. We are caught in a new phenomenon, and that's this damn electrical phenomena of computers and communication that's changing so rapidly. And one of the things that's seeming to do is to give us a whole lot more numbers. We're much more number and figure conscious, and we're very statistics conscious, so that we're discovering things we didn't know before. That certainly happened with the crime figures, where improved reporting has just thrown all the old figures out. Because we do it better, we don't know whether it was always that way or whether we're just seeing a reporting phenomena. And I think that is one change we are going through, this peculiar kind of statistical consciousness where we're getting much more number aware of things. And then we have to somehow do something about the fact that we know things we didn't know before. We know how many crimes there are, and before we could go blithely along pretending that they weren't there. If it didn't happen in my block, it didn't happen. Or if if it wasn't in my newspaper, I didn't have to worry about it. But we're caught facing things that before were somehow handled without our having to think about them. It may be that's providing a lot of our attention.
Have any studies been done on the reasons for the completed suicides?
Well, there have been a lot of attempts to do. Have you read any of that stuff? Completed suicides?
Sort of vaguely, but not really. I think that's maybe more your area.
Yeah.
The conjecture.
No. There isn't a whole lot known about it. There does seem to be a combination of things. Completed suicides as personality types, and that again is also hard, but there have been some guesses that the major personality type is a person who has a kind of deviant, first of all, has a rather deviant or individualistic style of thinking. They're not conventional thinkers. They may be rule breakers in a number of different ways. There are also people who have a lot of unusual thoughts. They are people who are troubled by thoughts which at least some other people would think were delusional or quite peculiar or out of the ordinary. And that is to be separated from their behavior, rule-breaking behavior, or unwillingness to be held down by conventions. And then finally, they're usually they're often depressed. They have a lot of sad feelings, at least. They have a lot of feelings that things are not good. The person, if there is a personality type who tries suicide, is much more often not so unconventional in terms of rule breaking. It may be a very kind of conventional, conscientious kind of person.
But he doesn't succeed at all. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, and on that we ought to be fair that if there is one thing that stands out in the numbers, it's that men do succeed more often, much more often than women, but they try less often.
Does that have anything to do with method?
Yeah, men usually pick much more violent techniques. But on completed suicides, they tend to be in an older age group. For instance, the numbers of successful suicides are found more often among men, more often among middle-aged individuals, more often among people who have alcohol problems, more often among people who have worked out a very careful plan and let somebody know about that. Usually they've done a lot of thinking about it. If you get a chance to bump into them, they are the people who have concocted a carefully thought out plan. Usually they have gone through some sort of financial trouble, and usually they are alone. They don't have friends or family. So those are at least some of the statistical phenomena associated with successful suicide.
Do you think that most of them have given a call, like to yes or intervention, or do you think the ones who really carry through and successful one are completely self-sufficient and cover their way and therefore are successful? Do you think that somewhere along the line they have made a plea, like a call to one of these places?
Can't say. Cannot say. The few that I do know about personally, as far as I can see, are people who make up their mind and keep that very much to themselves. I've seen some patients who later on have gone on to suicide. And they seem to go through a period of repeated dissatisfactions with their lives, repeated senses of failures, of trying and not quite getting to where they wanted to get, and then go through a very prolonged hopelessness period. It lasts really months or years of just not knowing what to do with their lives. And then they reach a point of resolve and carry through. And they don't ask for any help in and around that period. In the two cases that I know of, they made no attempt to contact anybody for months prior to the actual death.
Once a person has resolved the fact that he's going to commit suicide, there's very little you can do to intervene except for him commit him or something like that. Would that help, or they'll still find a way?
Well,
I'm not asking for a definite answer, but a feeling.
I don't know what to say. When people have, if people have resolved to commit suicide, they usually don't allow anybody in on that, so that the question doesn't come up.
What about?
They don't give you the chance to do anything. They plan well enough so that you don't get a shot at interfering. I think.
Well, what about? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
What about the people who do call, like YES and the emergency, whatever? Are they serious about committing suicide?
Well,
Like any attempt or any call that's like a threatened suicide, I'm going to take really seriously. There's all the things about, well, the reason why the person called is because they don't really want to do it, they just want somebody to stop them and all of that kind of thing. I don't know, like...
What if you don't succeed in stopping them?
Right. There's the person who calls who's already taken a number of pills and is going to take more. Is it because they want to be stopped, or is it because, they just want to talk to somebody while it's happening? I think it's really hard to say, which way it's going to be going. I think a lot of calls where the suicide question does come in, the person may not be serious that this is the alternative that they want to take. They just want, somebody to try and present some other alternatives for them. They can't see their way through it anymore.
So then you would say they are serious, generally? I
think they're always serious, but they might want, they might be asking for other alternatives.
they're certainly not to be ignored.
Mm-hmm.
There's people who are talking about suicide are struggling with something very, very serious. And even if they hope that some other alternative will appear in the act of contemplating anything that serious, it's possible for them to lose their life.
Yes, but at YES, wouldn't there be a possibility of some kid, just going around and calling up and saying, hey, I think it's
Sure. There's always the chance that it's a prank call, but I don't want to take the chance, if it's serious, to think that this is a prank call, So we'd like to come at all calls, come into all calls as this is the problem and this is what they're, this is for real. And it's a ripoff if you find out that it's not, and it can bum you out. But
are the people that call like YES usually teenagers and maybe older people for this other thing? Or?
The average age of our callers is 18 to 24, but we also get callers that are much younger and much older. We get, calls from older men and women in nursing homes who are very lonely and, want someone to talk to. We get, the variety, any age. But the majority of the callers are, between the ages of 18 and 24. I don't know what yours is like.
We have a wider span. I think that we see far fewer of the folks who call you, and probably spread upwards through the late 20s all the way up through 60s.
So much of the suicide is a surprise to people, whether it's a relative or someone close to that person. But is there any danger signals that you could watch from, say, relatives or just acquaintances or friends and someone, so this maybe wouldn't come just as a shock?
There are no dead giveaways. There are no regular things that appear that I know of.
How about cases where families have suicide history in the past?
I think it's an added burden for the members of that family because they have to do something with that knowledge. Again, it's I've seen people, for instance, spend a lot of their life struggling with a simple thing like their names. So having I know a young lady by the name of Faith who spends a lot of time worrying about that. And I suspect that if I had a relative who had committed suicide, and if my life was not going real well, that being there would be a fact that would just present one more thing to think about. I would hope that I could be more original, think of something better than that. But I think it is an added struggle.
This was a discussion I had with somebody who has in the past contemplated suicide, but this Japanese man who had built his body up to perfection, had a following.
Oh yes, the author.
Had the ultimate choice was his suicide.
Well, he came from a different cultural background, of course. We're now crossing lines into a whole different tradition.
But young people, I think, are using cross-cultural references all the time. I see that they're interested in Zen, and they're interested in everything.
Yeah.
How do you? It's just that basis that it's a different culture. If you're on an island, you can do it, but you're not on an island, you have to be.
No, how would there be a parallel here? The Japanese have gone through some very painful changes in their culture as they've westernized very rapidly. I suspect that pre-World War II, the Japanese really would not have known what to do with the kind of behavior, assertive behavior that's routine in America. The bantering, half-insulting, direct frankness that lacks the etiquette and politeness that typified the Oriental life. And for a Japanese individual to get some knowledge of American lifestyle and try to import it into his world would have been a tragedy. It's like putting sand in your ball bearings. It's just the machine wasn't made to operate that way. And so kids may now, exposed to a number of different cultures, explore the propriety of introducing one element of another cultural background into this culture. That's always interesting. It's fun to speculate about those things, but it is important to remember that all traditions have a context. They have a whole culture that surrounds any single tradition, and those things don't stand by themselves. The tradition of Harikari grew out of a whole religious, governmental tradition that had to do with loyalty to an emperor, that had to do with the proper ways of discharging one's duties, both to society and oneself, so that it'd be hard to separate that out. I could only say to somebody who was talking about that we ought to sit down and look at that in the whole context of Japanese life. And that guy was trying to reaffirm an old style of Japanese life when he committed harikari. A way that doesn't exist anymore, where people owed allegiance. It was a feudal culture, essentially. It's very similar to what we study in the Middle Ages in our world, where we have a manor lord and serfs and and knights. Well, that is not the world we live in today, and if that gentleman wanted to bring that kind of life back to Japan, that's wonderful, but that's a very specialized problem.
Yeah, I guess the only thing I'm thinking is that is it possible that he, even in his society, well, even in his society was an
Anachronism?
But even at the time when it was in, could the whole society have been that, what I would term sick, that the whole society, was uncalled for at that time even?
Well, that was a stable culture for a long, long time. It worked very, very well in its own context. That Japanese cultural tradition, I don't know enough about Japanese history, but I think that it was stable over a number of hundreds of years and included the tradition of harikiri as one way of dealing with failure to discharge one's duties. Now, I'm sure that there were all cultural traditions have loopholes. There are ways of dealing with problems, and a number of all sorts of alternatives exist. You'd have to know a lot about the Japanese culture to know how a man can redress various grievances and how he avoided putting himself in a spot where he committed that unpardonable sin of failing to discharge his duty properly and therefore having to commit harikiri. But it was a working system, just as dueling was a working system at one time in the Western culture as a way of redressing a grievance.
What would you say is the the most common method used in trying to commit suicide? Is it pills and stuff like this?
I think we probably come in the most contact with pills. It might be because, we're dealing with young people. The pills are accessible.
But I mean, you say that there's such a wide age range, from teenagers all the way up to adults. Now, what do they usually, or can't you?
Males most frequently use more aggressive weapons, guns, knives, hanging and jumping off of things. Females are more likely to use pills and gas, asphyxiation through carbon monoxide poisoning cars, those techniques.
Is there any special time, like weekends or holidays, times when you get more calls of that type? Or?
Probably somewhere around, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, or even, later in the morning than that, 4 o'clock in the morning. It's, when there's nobody else around, the television is off, all of that kind of thing. There's no distractions, that the problem becomes so big and, it's unable to put it aside. Holidays for sure, Christmas, Thanksgiving, that kind of thing, when people are probably the most lonely, the most alone. But then you get the 2 o'clock in the afternoon, threatened suicide. So, but I would say like early morning hours and holidays are definitely. Yeah.
I think that's when people feel their.
Yeah, I guess like other times of the day or other times of the year are there are more distractions. There's television, there's other people around. But, in the times when people are most alone are the times when their problems seem the biggest, I would say.
Are you suicide? Would they hurt other people?
Hurt other people?
Yeah.
I really don't know. One
of my teachers used to say suicide's always a two-party affair, and that it's always meant to hurt somebody else. Anyhow.
Are you talking about physically hurting somebody else, like in the case of murder or something like that?
Yeah.
I really don't know.
Occasionally there are murders combined with suicides. That's a fairly rare event, although it's the kind of thing that the French used to get famous for. The French crimes of passion, where people find lovers in other people's rooms and shoot each other or stab each other and then commit suicide. That's not a very common phenomenon. It does happen sometimes. But, The other part that's more important is that usually, very frequently, a suicide is meant as or has at least as a part of it, an expression of anger, frustration, hostility, dissatisfaction with somebody else.
Loneliness, I think, is a really big part of it.
Yeah, I was going to ask about, what Dr. Brantner said about, it being a sort of a hostile gesture toward the world or an insult. Very often do people leave notes, to specific people or...
There certainly are a fair number of people who do write notes. And they often are directed to a specific person.
When you talk to them, do you talk about that,
What's in the letters?
Well, yeah, and what, they're trying to say to that other person.
Sure. Because probably that's the important issue, and it could have been much more effectively dealt with than through a suicide, which is a rather inexact and clumsy way of getting your point across. There certainly are better ways to tell that person that you're not happy with them. You don't like the way they're doing things.
One thing that we come in contact with, fairly often too, is the accidental suicide with an overdose of barbiturates, and they're really hard to identify. If you're talking to the person on the phone and the person is overdosing on barbiturates, and very often with a combination of alcohol, the person sounds really happy. The whole world is beautiful, and I'm just going to do a couple more pills and make it even more beautiful. And the thing is, okay, this is where, like an immediate decision to trace or to get information from the person is vital. And one of the things that we tell our new volunteers in training is that, the most important thing to do is determine right away. And a lot of times the person will tell you, well, I've been taking barbs all day and I've been drinking a little wine and everything's just great. And, you don't have to worry about hurting that person's feelings by saying you're going to die. Give me your name and your address immediately. You don't have to worry about scaring them because, that's what's going to happen, and they probably aren't even aware of it at that time. Another thing that's really, really important is to keep that person on the phone until that ambulance gets there. And it might mean screaming at them, yelling at them, telling them to get up and move around and keep walking, but just to keep them awake until the ambulance actually gets there.
Does that moving around help a person that's involved?
Oh, yeah.
It does.
Sure, that's a very smart thing to do, especially with a sedative where motor activity feeds back more impulses to the brain, which keeps stimulation up, and the general level of arousal keeps people breathing more. And with most of the depressants, your major problem is with respiratory arrest. People just stop breathing.
How about trying to get, let's say, the depressed person or the person who's talking, I hear it going downhill, when I'm talking to a person.
Mm-hmm.
And I want to say, cut it out, cut this bullshit out and just, let's, I just want to choke them, and I tell them that in essence. Is that something that should be avoided? Would that be kind of thing that could be encouraged? What is it? Just play it when it comes to you?
Yeah. Well, I sure think that's...
Doesn't that make them clam up more?
That's
Just not
nah.
talk about it? Or was it-
I've been looking for years for a quote that some guy gave us when I was entering my internship at LA County. It was a quote from FDR, and I can only remember the sense of it, but I love it so much. Someday I suppose I'll find it. Essentially, FDR was speaking to a bunch of public servants of some sort or other, and he was saying, I want to compliment you people who have to every day make decisions, and very hard decisions, on inadequate information, and have to live with the consequences of your decisions. It is certainly more secure to deal with the pure science questions of doing a research study and to try and find pure truth, because if you find out something wonderful, but if you make a mistake, all it hurts are your numbers. But I especially want to compliment you people who have to face the awfulness of trying to do things when you don't know whether you're doing the right thing, because you carry the heavy burden of society's works. I don't know that there are guaranteed sure cure ways to do things. I always assume that the clinician who's stuck with the job of dealing with a very difficult situation does the best he can. And only he, at that moment, is fully aware of all of the facts, and he's got to make his own choices. I suppose that there are times when it makes perfectly good sense to be sore at that other person on the end of the line. That maybe that's the right thing to do. I sure wouldn't want to cut your options. I think that when you're stuck with the job and the responsibility is all resting on your shoulders, you do the best you can. And if that seems like a smart thing to do, go ahead and do it.
What kind of counseling do you provide for families and friends in cases of both successful and non-successful suicide?
See, that's a good question. Boy, is that a beauty. In cases of non-successful suicides, what usually happens is that we become involved with the patient victim, and to the extent that they will allow it, with those other important people that play a part in the suicide attempt, so that we'd be interested in promoting getting them involved. And so we move in that direction. A referral after the dust has settled to a family therapy setting of some sort, or a therapy setting that would include other people besides the patient, is a very reasonable thing to consider, and we always do take that into consideration. In the case of a successful suicide, boy, that's a beauty of a question, because that's really talking about preventive mental health care. We don't do that really, except when people bring it to us as a request for service. And I think that not too long ago, a couple years ago, somebody did some checking on this to see if we could try to do some preventive work by going out to families just following deaths, including suicide. And we found that our efforts were pretty much wasted. We went out to families right after deaths, and they really were too caught up in all of the events that follow a death to really want to get anything going at that time. So that most of our efforts proved fruitless. I do know that we are seeing more and more grief reactions that don't seem to go right. People have a death, a loss of some sort or other, and instead of working it through as people used to, somehow going through a grieving period and then recovering from that and picking up their lives, I've been impressed by how many abortive grief reactions I've seen in the last year. And I do think that's some sort of a growing problem. Whether or not it's a big enough problem to deserve a lot of services directed at it, because services cost money, and finding cases that really need your intervention is hard, I don't know. But it's certainly a question that people involved in the issues of community psychiatry and preventive psychiatry or mental health will have to think about. We just don't have enough people to do that now, so we take people as they come to us and let them be the selecting agent.
Do you suppose one of the reasons that you didn't get a good reaction from this was because of the social stigma attached to this, where it is, let's face it, been more or less a naughty word? It has been. Just the fact that it's a misdemeanor on the record, and if there is a misdemeanor, that brings up another question. Has it ever been prosecuted? Is there any case on record in Minnesota? I think this is very fascinating tonight.
It does.
And how do they go about prosecuting, if it's successful, especially?
I suspect it gave the police the right to incarcerate somebody who made a suicide attempt at one time, and that's kind of an out-of-date law. That's now dealt with through the mental health law, which allows us to put somebody in a hospital if they appear to be a serious danger to themselves or others. But even that's under attack. There's a fellow by the name of Tom Saz who's spent a lot of time fighting for removal of all involuntary mental health efforts, and he'd like to see the suicide laws stricken from the books and not make it possible to involuntarily incarcerate anybody who made a suicide attempt. So even that's up for question nowadays.
What do you think of that attempt to break down the forced incarceration?
Yeah. If I were being completely self-interested and selfish, I would say that would certainly reduce my responsibilities significantly. Then I wouldn't have to wrestle with that question. Because if it's not on the law books, then I don't have to worry about it. I can say that that's somebody else's right to decide for themselves. That's not the case now, so it is a serious problem, and I think properly so, that people who are trying to kill themselves are showing well, I remember, and again, another old quote, H.L. Mencken once wrote that all the suicides that he had ever known had lived in really intolerable circumstances, and 9 out of 10 had performed admirable self-judgments. But that aside, I think most people who consider suicide, I guess I'd have to say 99% are using terrible judgment. And that somebody ought to at least sit down for a while with them and help them sort through the issues that confront them. So I guess I think the law makes some sense.
In reference to the social stigma attached to this, many people have a lot of anxiety, especially young people. I know just thinking about it. Maybe they can fantasize it in their own mind and think about it. And, this causes some people a lot of anxiety. Is there any counseling for this, or what's, this vast difference between maybe thinking about it, not being dominated by that in your mind, and then the next step down? But all these variables would tie in, this depression and everything else. Or do you think that more groups like this, just creating an awareness and education about suicide, would be a benefit?
I don't know. I think it's really important not to be afraid to use the word. As in terms of working with or dealing with someone on a telephone, like the tendency might be to sidetrack that. The person says, "Well, I don't even know if it's worth living anymore," or something like that. I feel like it's important to say, "Well, are you considering taking your own life, or are you considering suicide?" Verbalizing it for them, so that they can get more in touch with, is that what they're actually feeling? And if that is, if that's what it is, then it might be easier to work around it. I really feel like it's important to be able to use that word with the person so that they become more aware of what they're actually considering.
I just read an article that said that if, you're talking to someone who's very depressed, that you should bring it up, and that, it's very, very seldom that people ever decide to commit suicide just because a therapist mentioned it. This isn't going to say, "Oh, that's just what I needed," just the suggestion I was waiting for. And whereas if you bring it up, you can talk about it, and if they have been thinking about it, maybe you're the first person they've been able to.
It's like, if someone calls in and says, "Well, I just called to say goodbye to someone," that they're thinking about taking their own life, and if you get so uptight with it that you go, "Oh, well, let's talk about the problem then," instead of the actual word suicide, I think, it's really going to put them off. Okay, now I don't have anybody to talk to about it, and that's where it ends up.
You had mentioned, I can't remember, in later teenage years, 18 to 23, was it?
24?
18 to 24, so.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any idea, or is there any conclusion that you can come to what their reasoning might be? I mean, is it just that they're tired of living or fed up with society and this kind of thing? Or, did they ever give a reason for wanting to commit suicide? Or?
One thing is that suicide is not a unitary phenomenon, or the people who approach the phenomena of suicide are not unitary. There are an awful lot of people thinking about it in a lot of different ways. and there's such variability that to try and capsulize it into a single thing is to not do it justice. That's just not the...
But I mean, like, well, okay, let's say in your work that you've been doing, could you say what the greatest reason has been for, like, kids wanting to do it, or I mean, is that going all overboard too? I mean, well,
I don't know if I could really make a generalization on it. I would say that, a lot of the calls we're getting not directly associated with suicide, but a lot of the calls are, the whole loneliness and depression area. Nobody cares, that kind of thing. Maybe, but I couldn't make a generalization as far as, and then they go from there to suicide.
Yeah, and let me push that one further. But that is usually, if you take that one step further, is related to a breakdown in interpersonal relationships. Somehow or other, that person has not been able to have rewarding, or at least in their view, not adequately rewarding interpersonal relationships. Somehow or other, they're not getting enough out of what they do with other people. And they become discouraged at struggling with that problem because they're not finding a way to improve things.
well, then it wouldn't be with family problems.
Could be family, could be friends. I've seen it happen in connection with working relationships. So that's also possible. But there usually is an interpersonal element to the suicide.
I'm sorry. Let me go ahead.
What is the usual call? What level do the people come from? I mean,
what kind of economic background, or like where they live, that kind of thing.
yeah.
It's really it's changing. We don't get very many calls from like the core city. We don't get very many calls from, like, say, the north side of Minneapolis, the black community. We get quite a few, like, from the south side of Minneapolis, quite a few from the suburbs, and from the St. Paul suburbs. The people who have everything. The good school systems, the big school systems where people, just don't have the personal contact.
Does that surprise you?
Not really. I think that's part of the whole suburb kind of culture. The family isn't as strong, it's more diversified. The school is large, there's not a lot of personal contact. This is like away from the suicide kinds of calls. This is just the general kinds of calls that we get.
Is that the same for you?
No, not exactly the same. We take a lot more of our business from the core city, both from the north side and from the near south side. That's traditionally been General Hospital's area of most intense support.
You were talking before about, one problem being, relationship problems, interpersonal relationship problems. Well, and then before, when you were talking about treatment, you really were speaking about life situation kinds of things, or at least some of the things you mentioned, financial problems or family problems. If it is a person who just feels they can't relate to anyone, what can you possibly say to that person, that's going to talk them out of suicide? How do you convince them that there's hope? Especially if they're older, like 50 years old, and for 50 years it doesn't look like they've...
Well, that is one suicide that I do know of. A patient we followed up who had been on our inpatient service was a man like that. He had, I think he had been married for about 2 years in his early 20s. Had divorced, had no children, had then begun a lengthy course in and out of state hospitals. Had never really had much in the way of any kind of career. When he came to us, had been in a nursing home for a number of years without friends there. A rather withdrawn, quiet guy who was not mixing it up with patients or staff, just a polite fellow who was mostly in the walls and not much out where anybody could see him. And we really weren't able to do a whole lot for him. We tried to get him going some more, make him a little more active, and for a while that worked, but about 4 months after he left our ward, he did commit suicide. And he did it in a way that suggested that it was a very rational, coherent, not a deluded, psychotic choice. He was as polite as ever to people around him, and carried on like the pleasant but innocuous individual that he'd been for many, many years. His ties with life had been tenuous for so long that we weren't able to revitalize them.
How do you think commit suicide?
How many?
How did he?
With a gun.
Hmm?
Yeah.
Sometimes it's really almost impossible to try and find alternatives for a person. They present a life that just seems so unbelievably bad. They're just groping, trying to find something.
I don't want it to sound quite that bad. Almost everybody that we see, I'm sure it's the same for you as it is for us, isn't presented with that kind of alternative. That simply isn't the case. That their lives may be chaotic at this moment, that things have degenerated and are not at the level that they once were, is usually the case. But the individual that I'm speaking of, the fellow that I'm talking about, would be hard to find nowadays because state hospitals have changed. This was a man who spent 14 years at Anoka State Hospital working on, I think, in the laundry, and then became a victim of the change in mental health. Mental health went through a phase where we decided people were going to leave hospitals and they weren't going to stay there and get custodial care for years. And he was one of the people who was swept out of the state hospitals in the late 50s, early 60s movement away from hospitals. Well, he wasn't adaptable to that situation. He had made a peculiar kind of adaptation to life in that state hospital, and he was unable to sustain himself outside of it. Board and care homes were no real alternative for him. So he's a very unusual person. Most people that we see have vital existences. They may be tumultuous and painful, but they are not sterile. And it's very hard to find a person who has a truly kind of sterile existence. It takes years and years of practice and effort to develop a life that has no ties, no involvement, that does not have emotional guts to it, of some sort or other.
Does religion provide a direction for some of these people? In a sense, suicides, it appears almost one thing they have in common is just a lack of direction. Now, whether it's a high achiever or a successful business executive who just, it's a constant drive and all of a sudden there's no direction to it, or a complete failure with a career. Well, I was wondering what the religious background maybe be on suicide, if that would be give them a direction and a hope.
Got any answers? It sure can. I can think of several people who we've seen on our inpatient service who've come through the crisis unit and then ended up on our inpatient service, who really have needed the kind of meaning and social setting that a religious institution provides. And we've helped them to reestablish their ties with a religious group that they broke off with many, many years before. And they found that was very meaningful. There is a whole plethora of activities and interested people and a whole new kind of interest in life that's available to them through that. That's one alternative if it's right for that person. It's not right for a lot of people. Religion is not an acceptable alternative to many people. So that has to be person-specific as an effort. You wouldn't try it on somebody who didn't like that.
As a counseling type person, do you ever find it hard or do you find it difficult not to be convinced by the suicidal person that they're really right or that maybe their way is the only meaningful way? Or are you always sure of yourself in that way?
No. Another thing is a lot of times, suicidal people are very manipulative people too, that they can turn things around. Everything that you say, can be turned around and made not acceptable. So I personally think it's a very, very difficult kind of a call for me to handle. Is that it?
Yeah, I can see myself saying that, after a point, well, maybe they're right, and what business is it of mine to...
I guess it gets more to the point, too, of I don't know where else to go with this, And that might be the point where I'd say, why don't you try, and do a referral? If I'm going to start if I'm going to start coming down, if I'm not going to be able to raise that person up at all, I think I'm probably doing more harm than good. And that would be the point where I'd say, well, I think maybe you should try talking to someone here or there or something like that.
Who do you refer people to?
Who do we refer people to? Crisis intervention, Walk-in Counseling Center, Ramsey Mental Health, a number of counseling centers in the Twin Cities area.
This varies on why the person.
Yeah, what the problem is. Many times there's a family counseling center in St. Paul, if that seems to be what the problem is. So it kind of depends on what the problem is. I would say generally, like most of our referrals would go to walk-in counseling or possibly crisis intervention. Walk-in counseling center because, like many of the callers are, I don't know if you want to call it counterculture. Walk-in counseling center is a large house, that is very unclinical, a more comfortable situation.
Although people have their certificates and degrees, they're counselors. They're registered
they're all
counselors
professional people. They're psychologists, psychiatrists,
social workers,
counselors.
whatever else. They don't have any volunteer. No, they do.
Urban Toffer in the book Future Shock talks about with the inability to cope with accelerated social change and how this is manifest in various ways. As a clinical psychologist, do you share his views that suicide is a growing social reaction to this inability to cope, and can you place it, let's say, in categories of people, professions, or related to cultural values, say financial and so on?
Luckily, I'm a clinician. I don't have to worry about things like that. My only problem is to take each case as it comes. When I was more of a student, I had to worry about things like that as we discussed those issues. I know that as far back as in my reading, Erich Fromm was the first guy that I ran across who was using suicide as a diagnostic tool to talk about a sick culture, and was comparing our figures against the figures in the Scandinavian countries, which are quite high, and then less high in many of the European countries. I think it's an interesting tool to speculate with, and first you got to have your numbers and you got to look at them and see how try to judge how accurate your numbers collection is. So that's a first level problem to see if, first of all, you're collecting good figures, and then try and compare them cross-culturally and see what conclusions you can draw from that. I was always surprised to discover that suicide was a high-rate phenomena in Scandinavian countries. It shocked me to find out that Denmark and Sweden ran close behind us, and I didn't expect that. It's a way of opening up new speculations, but I don't know that I can jump immediately to it being diagnostic of social change. So many of the people I see have that I talk to when I talking to somebody with a suicide problem are caught up in something very specific to their life. Whether that's what's going wrong in their life is a reflection of that greater social change that we're all suffering from, I can't say, but on a face-to-face confrontation with that problem, it always seems to come down to people living their everyday lives and not living them as well as they'd like to. I don't know.
Since you mentioned cultures and mentioned the Scandinavian countries, I think that probably individuality and freedom, personal freedom, is something that tends to have more, a society or a country where the freedom is a lot more wide, tends to have more suicidal, such as the Southern European countries. Their family ties and inner relations with other people are so close together that you always have somebody to go and sit around with. And in Scandinavian countries, there's, like everybody can do whatever they want, like the girls can walk away from home and do whatever they want, and then later on they just don't have anybody to go to. And it's just sort of the freedom, I think, of the independent people, of each person.
That's a funny thing, because I've always, this shows a stereotype view, not a knowledge, but it's always been my view that the Scandinavian countries are distinguished by the fact of their social consciousness and sense of concern about cultural issues or social issues. I think that that's demonstrated by the fact that two of our states, Minnesota and Wisconsin, which have a high Scandinavian population, have always been really quite socially progressive and have developed social programs at least at a rate equal to or ahead of most of the rest of the country. So I've always thought of the Scandinavian countries as parts of the world where the culture demands more of you in terms of social responsibility. Italians, my dad's Italian. And Southern Europeans are kind of irresponsible people. They allow themselves to be hysterical. They don't give a damn, and they break things a lot.
Get away all the friction inside themselves. You see, so you can go and scream and break a plate in somebody's head, and that's the end of the problem. You don't have to go and kill yourself next.
Yeah, well.
And she's talking about fitting in or having a place and structure, really. And structure can mean having, knowing who it is that you can go to talk to, or who it is you can go hit over the head with a plate. A really lonely person may not even have anyone they can, go and kick in the shins. And, when you talked about, this man who had been at Anoka, I wonder if there's, people who have been in institutions in a highly structured situation and then get out, if there's, a higher tendency toward suicide with them. This too is just speculation.
Well, all our figures, though, that do exist on the successful suicide, the ones I was talking about, the middle-aged person, financial troubles, no family ties, suggest the kind of person you're talking about. But it is a person who's become emotionally isolated from others. His involvement in and with other people has become relatively low. So in that sense, yeah, that need not necessarily be somebody who was institutionalized and then set out from there, but it does mean somebody who's reduced their involvement in the lives of other people and their involvement in his.
I spent 32 years in the state hospital, and I don't feel like suicide.
Good.
And I have a job. I'm going to school. I have a great deal of interest in life. So not always you mental institutions have suicide feelings. 'Cause I've been 32 years in Cambridge.
You're right. We stand corrected. That does not have to have anything to do with it.
And it's the whole thing about, you know, having a desire to live and wanting to live and being interested in things. There's another thing too that like we haven't really gotten into and that I think is sort of important, and I guess it kind of gets back to what you were saying is, you know, like people who really smother their emotions and their feelings, you know, not getting into exactly what you're feeling and acknowledging it. And I think that's something that's really important. As you keep, you know, pushing those feelings down and not acknowledging them, it gets more frustrating all the time. I guess that's, you know, like part of the thing that I see, you know, as yes being valid is trying to, you know, name those feelings, trying to pick up on them, trying to identify them for people so that they, you know, they can get more in touch with them so that they can feel them, whether it's guilt or it's frustration or it's pain. You know, it's really an important thing.
You say then that primarily the people who commit suicide are introverts rather than extroverts?
No. I don't
We're
think
talking about, you're now talking about all the people we come in contact with rather than trying to narrow that down to the few people who have successes. And it's too wide a group. If you try and take all those people who in some way either contemplate or actually do make an attempt at suicide, you couldn't make it simple enough to say that that's going to be all introverts or mostly introverts even. That's too big a group of people. It spans too many years, starting in the early teens and going up through the 60s, and includes too many different types of people.
it's almost impossible to make, you know, generalizations because it's just, you know, the wide variety of, you know, human beings, of problems, of situations.
It's such a heterogeneous group, really is. Everything.
For people that attempt to commit suicide and don't, would you be able to categorize those in a particular type of?
Well, are you talking about people who are not successful at attempting? I mean, attempt but not successful? So
and that perhaps they might just want to attempt but not succeed anyway.
Yeah.
I don't know if you be able to, I suppose you probably be able to screen them out as the types that they want to attempt committing suicide and they don't, and that's what they want to do.
You missed that part of the discussion. We talked about that earlier. I guess that decided that you really couldn't tell who was really serious about it and who wasn't, you know.
Are people who attempt and are not successful at a higher risk?
Sure are.
They are. And
that's right.
Additional attempt?
That's right.
Is that through blind ignorance that they might finally accomplish it, or is that
Certainly that's part of it, but we just know that people who have tried before are at higher risk than people who have never tried. They're more likely to try again, so that those old saws about suicide that, you know, people who talk about it won't do it are nonsense. That is not true. And people who have tried won't have passed that phase. That need not be the case at all. People who have tried have looked upon this, whether sensibly or not, as a way of approaching an issue, as a possible solution. As I say, I usually find that that's bad judgment on their part, or a failure to know enough about life to be aware of some other ways of trying to solve problems. But if they've thought about it, the chances are they'll think about it again if they run up against similar kinds of problems and issues, and they'll be at risk again. It's not possible to categorize it any more than that, except that hopefully if their first contemplation of suicide was handled well, they may have learned something from that their struggle with the concept of suicide was an attempt to really struggle with some other problem, and that they came up with suicide as the last possible answer when they couldn't think of something better. That ought to be some sort of signal that to go back and take a look at the problem again. That when you get to the question of suicide, what you've simply done is get to the point of saying, geez, I can't think of anything else. Now that doesn't mean that therefore that's the best possible answer. It simply means I can't think of a better one at the moment.
On that point, the speaker characterized suicide as a wrong-headed act, and I think he even used the word a stupid act. Can you relate this to an intelligence level or an intellect? Place it on an intellectual level and say this is the reaction of someone who hasn't fully explored the possibilities that exist. And of course, that's a rationalization in itself. But for this person, is it a saying, as you said, that they've explored all of the possibilities, the other options, and written them off, and chosen this, or is it more an emotional act rather than an act of rationale?
Yeah. The first problem is assuming that anybody struggling with their own personal problems uses their intellect very effectively. We're so much animals of passion or emotion that a bright person is very likely to miss obvious alternatives just because they're involved in their own personal problems. We become very cloudy once we're dealing with things about ourselves and about our personal life. We get to having almost blinder-like vision. There are some things that just never occur as possibilities. Only somebody outside of the situation can see it. You may have run across it in any line of work where you have some friends who are trying to solve some problem. It's something that you know about, and they're struggling with it, and they can't see the solution, and then they happen to present it to you over coffee, or you hear something about it, and well, what about this? And they didn't think of it. It's the advantage of being outside of the situation that gives one the opportunity to maybe offer something new. People get fixed in specific tracks, and that has nothing to do with intelligence. It has to do with habits of thinking or just getting too close to a problem to be able to see it in any perspective.
I just, now that you mentioned that, I want to clarify my previous point. It was exactly that I meant by extroverts and introverts. Probably the people that, would come out and talk their problems and mention it to many people, and the people that don't, they just keep them to themselves and sit there and limit the solutions just to what they can come up with. That's where my original
question
thought was, that
I got you.
People that wouldn't very seldom talk about their problems. They don't like to talk about them. They think that they bore other people. They just keep them to themselves. Where if you're just going and have a problem, you go and tell them all your friends, you're going to get all kinds of solutions, and or just to hear yourself say them, you might yourself come up with something.
Exactly.
That might come, that you wouldn't have thought it out yourself because you haven't been talking out loud with yourself.
Yeah. I think that's very true of a large number of people that we see. That it's just that kind of trouble that they have a hard time engaging with the problem of even talking about what troubles them. For reasons of shame, they feel that it's shameful to talk about problems, or they feel that I can't ask, it's not right to talk about that sort of thing with other people.
Or it's like, what will that person think of me if I tell them what's really going on with me, that kind of thing too. I think, this is one thing that we see really often, and this is kind of aside from the suicide question, is that, people will call, just for somebody who will listen as they talk out whatever's going on. And as they keep talking and talking, everything's going around in here, and it's getting really confused. As it comes out verbally, it seems to get clarified, for them already, with maybe a couple of words, a couple of suggestions.
Yeah, that's just a phenomenal thing, that when people sit down and tell their story, they frequently, as you suggest, hear it.
Mm-hmm.
Hear it for the first time in a new way. There's something about running your thoughts around inside your head that makes it easier to not see certain things about them, and the very process of discussing them sometimes provides the solution.
There is also the person who just talks on to different agencies, like the same problem to 15 agencies, and never gets a solution. That happens too, right?
It doesn't
Sure.
One of the things I've been along with trying to commit suicide, these people sometimes in other states, postpartum depression is. I don't know how prevalent would suicide be in that post-abortion states. People are depressed. It's still, it's this postpartum type of depression. People who are just dropped out of school, college students, or men who have just lost their jobs. I don't know if you can lump all that depression in one. I'm mainly interested in the abortion and the postpartum, because I've come across some calls that way.
Mm-hmm.
I've never had a call like that. So.
As far as clinical postpartum depressions, which are a kind of unique, specialized, very clear-cut entity, that's not often a suicide issue. People are usually depressed enough that they don't really, although they may be having suicidal thoughts, they're really not high suicide risks. What's so prevalent for folks like that is that they are just so unhappy, so truly depressed. A post-abortion phenomena is a different kind of thing, and is in some ways closer related to a man losing a valued job. It usually has a great deal to do with injured self-esteem and a sense of being frustrated or hurt or having suffered some sort of personal wound. In those situations where something bad seems to happen in a person's lives, there are times when they get very down in the dumps all of a sudden and may get bombed or just get discouraged. And at those times, people are likely to feel like, hell, it's not worth the trouble, and begin thinking about suicide.
I beg your pardon, Beth.
Yeah.
Sorry to interrupt, Beth. Things are going well, and no one wants to break them. I was wondering if I might suggest the possibility of a break for a moment or so. If anyone is interested in moving around, becoming involved with other panels, or vice versa.